All right. Hello and good morning, everybody. My name is Danielle Coco. I'm the marketing director at SUSTA, and we are very excited today about our webinar on how sustainability is shaping the Canadian market. Sustainability is such a hot topic these days here in the US and around the world, and it's such an important topic for us to address. So we are excited to welcome Argyle PR, who is SUSTA's consultant in the Canadian market. They are going to be our featured presenters today. Daniel Tisch is with us and Jesse Sitnick. But before I introduce them and they give their presentation, I just wanted to say a few words about SUSTA. You know, our mission is to help US agricultural producers get their products and their brands out into the world. And that, that's always our mission. That's really the core of what we do. So how does sustainability factor into that? Sustainability, especially with the current administration in the US, is such an important topic. It's a priority for USDA, but we're seeing that around the world, from government policy in foreign countries, corporate culture, and consumers. They're demanding sustainable products, and they want to see those practices, carried out, especially in agriculture. So as we think about trade and agriculture, it's so important that that we start looking at sustainability. And for so many of our producers who are already doing things that are very much with the environment in mind, it's sharing that story. I do think that a lot of US producers are doing things. It's part of their daily, habits, and how they produce is with that in mind. And maybe it's now time to just get that message out into the world. So we have started talking with our participants at SUSTA and trying to help share those stories. We created a new page on our website called the Sustainable South, where we're sharing stories about different types of producers and how they are their daily how they're producing their products is with sustainability in mind. So if any of you have a story to share that you would be willing to share with us, I would love to know about that. So please reach out to me, and we could do a 15-minute phone interview and we could get something written up. I mentioned that USDA now has this as a big priority. And I think, to underscore their focus on sustainability, they have started a lot of different projects, especially the Foreign Agricultural Service, to make sure that those stories are heard around the world. So I wanted to share a clip. I'm going to do a new share of a video that they created about Southern producers. We helped with this video a little bit, and it's just a great story to share. But I think it also shows, the fact that USDA is now producing videos like this for the foreign marketplace. It really, I think that is a great indicator that this is important to everybody.
The ecosystem that the rice and crawfish and even the soybeans and all of the 6,000 acres, when you really sit back and look at the way that the system is all designed, everything complements each other and everything feeds off each other. Soybean crop will change up a bunch of weed cycles, put some nitrogen back in the ground, increase the soil till, which subsequently helps the next rice crop. We will harvest 2 crops of rice, then we'll come back and we'll go into crawfish production. All the while providing waterfowl habitat. The crawfish ponds. When we finish with that, we're going to go in and lower the water. We can take that water, reuse it on other rice fields, provide shorebird habitat at that point. So there's a method to the madness here. Everything that we're doing is all interrelated. It's all a big system, and it's all intertwined. All of our conservation practices, our sustainable. Our main goal here is always to leave it better than what we got it as. So hopefully the 7th generation will be able to take advantage of that.
Just wanted to show that, it's they're doing 40 of these videos that are going to show different aspects of U.S. agriculture and, how we're doing it responsibly here in the U.S. And these will be shared in the international community. Love that video. Real quick about our programs, for those of you who are not so familiar with SUSTA, we have so many services and various programs, whether you're new to exporting or an experienced exporter. So please be in touch if you are interested in getting more involved. Next week, we are hosting an in-person seminar in New Orleans. Yay. Our first in-person SUSTA seminar. The exciting thing about this one is we are bringing our consultants in from around the world, including Argyle, and they're coming in for some internal meetings that SUSTA is having, but we asked them to come in a day early so that they could give presentations and we could open it up for our US suppliers, for our companies and participants to hear their presentations and meet with all of our consultants. So if you haven't registered and would like to, I think registration closes tomorrow. So the seminar is April 5th and it's in New Orleans. All right, so that is it for me. This is my contact information, Danielle@susta.org. But now I would like to hand it over to Daniel and Jesse. Daniel is the CEO of Argyle PR. As I mentioned, they are our consultants in Canada, and they have been for, I would say, 10 plus years. They've been great partners in the Canadian market. Daniel is one of Canada's leading advisors to business and government leaders on communications, public engagement, and reputation management. And then Jesse Sitnick, who is Vice President of Corporate and Public Affairs at Argyle, is among the most experienced and effective clean economy communicators in the sector. She was former head of strategic communications for the World Wildlife Fund in Canada. So I think she is quite the expert in this field, and we're excited to hear from her. So I am going to go ahead and stop sharing, and you guys should be able to share your presentation.
Can everyone see?
Yep.
Great. Excellent.
Okay, that's great. Excellent. Well, thank you. Jesse and I are really excited to be with you today. And as you see, the title of our presentation today changed a little bit from the first conception, which Danielle shared with you, which is more about the Canadian market, kind of looking at Canadian market trends. But Jesse and I were thinking about it, and in the end, we just thought about SUSTA's mission here, which Danielle enunciated a few minutes ago, right? Increasing agricultural exports from small US suppliers to the foreign marketplace. And so we started to think about this in a way that that's maybe a bit different, and that's thinking about it not just as a challenge, but as an opportunity. One, to generate a competitive advantage for American and Southern US in particular, the Southern US in particular, its products, its services, its companies, and to make sustainability an advantage. Our focus, of course, is on Canada today, because that's where we work and that's our expertise. But our goal really, I think, is to add value, we hope, to SUSTA companies more broadly, help you understand trends that, that really cross borders, right? That are really international in nature right now. Today's sustainability consumer, the trends, the business and marketing risks, the opportunities. And in terms of our lens on this, obviously we come at it not as scientists or advocates. We come at it as first of all as communicators, because increasingly sustainability relies on effective communication with buyers, with retailers, with consumers, with regulators, with employees, with everybody that a business needs to be truly sustainable. And note that I'm not talking about sustainability just in environmental terms. I'm talking about literally the sustainability of the business. I'm talking about it as well in economic terms, because our second lens is that we're business people. I started my career in the Canadian government, where I worked in foreign affairs, international trade, many other areas for the first decade or so of my career. And Jessie started her career in the nonprofit space, working with the World Wildlife Fund and other major nonprofits. But today we're consultants, and for most of my career, that's been what I've been privileged to do, advising a lot of organizations, companies, governments, specifically around economic development and how we can make sustainability an advantage for exporters from the southern states is something we're really excited to talk about today. So on the next slide, you'll see, I'm just going to highlight, just how privileged we are to have a very long-term relationship now with SUSTA, going on 12 years now. And it's a real privilege to work with so many companies, and I'm privileged as well to work with a great team. And some of them you see on the call today, Parina Chaudhry, who is the Vice President of our Agribusiness and International Trade team, dedicated team we have at Argyle, Nikita Ravi, Heidi Kim, and Kaylin Creer are also with us today. And I'm sure you know some of these folks, and or we'll get to know them in the months ahead, especially if you're able to join the meeting that Danielle talked about next week. Okay, so moving along. So the other point, I guess, is that the consumer is changing because obviously there's been an urbanization of our key markets, and we're becoming a little bit less connected to the farm, right? And we're seeing this too in the relative power certainly in Canada of rural communities in Canadian politics. We're definitely seeing that as the population becomes more urban. But you don't have to go too far to find connections to the farm. My mother grew up on a cattle farm in Latin America, in Uruguay, and this is me riding. I don't mean to imply that I'm a regular rider, but this was me experiencing those routes just a few months ago when I was down in Uruguay. And so it is interesting to be able to tap into that latent connection that we each and all have with agriculture. And I'll invite Jessie to comment on her experience.
Oh, this is just, so just for your benefit, I am Canadian, but I'm also American. I grew up in the South. I am from Maryland. I went to school in New Orleans. I got married and spent the first year of my marriage in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So I am very much a Southern girl at heart. But when I moved back to Ontario, I married a man from a small Southwestern farming town. And this is actually me at my sister-in-law's family farm, which has been in her family for many, many generations. And it's a few hours drive from the big city of Toronto, but it's where my kids have learned about where food comes from. So it was an important part of our life and raising our kids.
So let's talk about how we can make that connection more explicit and tell great stories and great narratives, as Danielle was talking about earlier. And so today we want to talk a little bit about the following things. I'll start by giving you a bit of a big picture here about sustainability and those letters that we hear increasingly these days: ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues, and agri-food. Jessie will get into the Canadian policy landscape, and then we'll go on to talk about, to give you a bit of a profile of the sustainable consumer in Canada, share a case study with you, which we hope you'll find interesting, and then close with some final food for thought to make this, I hope, as useful and actionable for you as possible. So I'm good. I'm not hearing any objections from anyone I can hear, so let's go on. Okay, so let's talk about the big picture, sustainability, ESG, and agri-food. And I guess the first point that we want to make here is that agri-food is on the front lines of a world that's changing. The paradox identified by Time magazine that you see quoted here is that the human population is expected to climb to close to 10 billion by the middle of the century, but yet the global food supply is predicted to plummet. Now, we can look at this in a pessimistic way, but we can also look at this as an opportunity, right? Because we have a product that is in demand, or not just a product, we have many agricultural products that are in demand, that are profoundly necessary. And also we have in the United States, the most innovative, farming industry in the world. And so really critical to meet that epic challenge that lies ahead. And so as it's on the front lines of the changing world, it's also top of mind for many of us. And I'm sure for many of you as you go to bed at night, right? And that's really the first question we're going to ask you today, because we don't want this just to be us talking. We want to invite you to participate in the conversation as well, and you know, and hear one another's perspectives too. So I don't know if you've used this sort of polling technology before, but it's super easy. You can either use the little QR code in the top left of this slide, and it'll take you to a website. Or if you're like me, you know, you might find it easier to just go to slido.com, enter that code 976081 when prompted, and we'd love to see your answer to this question. And so as you begin to answer, we'll start to see the screen populated. And so we'll give you a moment to do that. And Jesse and I will here we go. Okay, so I see somebody's reminding us of the code. That's awesome. And someone else talking about climate, their climate in particular, as something that's keeping them up at night. What else? What other issues are keeping you up? Slido.com. There we go. Water. Interesting. Interesting that two people separately put in water. Lack of water and clean water is distinct issues keeping them up. Everybody, please, you know, no matter what your role is, we'd love to populate this. More about, let's see, food supply, rising food prices. I'm surprised that took this long for that issue to come up here. What other sustainability issues? Whether it's sustainability in you know, societal terms or in terms of your own business, we'd love to hear your perspectives here. So we got water a couple of times, we got food supply, we got prices, we got climate, we got sustainability and packaging. Yeah.
We're going to talk about that later today too.
We are. Yeah, that's a good one. I like the use of all caps here too, you know. I don't know if that suggests a particularly important concern. Maybe it does. Probably does. Any other input on this question? Give another few seconds to see if we get anyone else popping in here. Okay, well, good enough for now. So it's good to see some of those issues come up. And I guess the interesting thing here is that what's on your minds, it really isn't that different from what's on the minds of the public conversation. You know, and you see some, you know, sample of different headlines, you know, that we pulled here. You know, what food's going to be available? What's it going to cost? What choices should I make? How should food be grown? What about the supply chain? These are all issues that are emerging as important. And so thinking about that conversation, we always believe, and we always advise our clients to be prepared when that conversation comes to us, but also to look for opportunities to go out and join that conversation and lead that conversation if possible, to tell our stories and to talk about how we can be solutions to some of those things that are on the minds of consumers. So the key thing to think about from our perspective is that sustainability is not a strategy. Sustainability is an outcome, right? Ideally, sustainability is what happens if the investments that we make today in the environmental and social and business conditions, you know, that surround us, in which we work and in which we live, you know, that if we're making those investments in a way that's generating value for us over the long term, and we can look at the different types of outcomes, the livelihoods of, you know, our farmers and our manufacturers and everybody involved in the industries, environmental stability and security, and of course, social cohesion and trust. All of these are outcomes for sustainable businesses and a sustainable society. And ESG, those initials we keep hearing, ESG is a strategy. And this is a sample from the social responsibility report, or the sustainability report from Loblaws, the largest retailer, food retailer in Canada, grocery retailer. And we thought this was really well done and very thoughtful, because what they've done here is they've mapped what's important to stakeholders around their particular ESG impacts, right? You know, of their business. And so what they've tried to do is think about how they can understand and act on the environmental issues, the social issues, and the governance issues that matter to their stakeholders, and therefore the long-term profitability of their businesses. So it's looking, as you see here, at impacts could be physical, They could be, the extent to which they're ready for changes in policy, shifts in market demand, social license, and reputation. And this is facing every industry. Jesse will talk a little bit about the Canadian policy environment in a moment, but this has been a big week in Canada because the government released details of how it's going to achieve its climate targets. And they're really looking industry by industry at what each industry needs to do. And so being ready for shifts in policy that could affect our businesses becomes really important, as do all of these other areas listed here. So looking at the drivers, not surprising. I'm sure that if we'd done a little Slido for you on this, you would very quickly have told us that these are all really fundamental audiences, publics, stakeholders, drivers of the decisions that we make, whether it's buyers, grocery retailers, policymakers, investors, or consumers. We need to think about all of these as the key stakeholders that we need to engage. And so let's look at it for a moment from the standpoint of going back to Slido. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you feeling the most pressure? We outlined those various different stakeholder groups, and we're curious if you could join slido.com again and fill in the code. If you were already there, you may see this pop up automatically. I'm not sure, but we'd love your perspective as to where you feel the most pressure. Is it from buyers? Is it from your shareholders? Is it government, regulators, consumers? Okay, we're seeing the votes come in. All right, consumers are leading buyers here. Yeah, okay, interesting. So far, no one highlighting. It's kind of interesting here because no one's often when we ask these sorts of questions, there's a lot of focus on activists, particularly in agriculture. But it's interesting here that your feedback so far to the poll is that it's consumers. Any other votes on this? Don't be shy. Please join if you want. Okay, interesting little snapshot. Feel free to join afterwards until the next question comes. You should still be able to see it. Okay, so different sectors, of course, have different challenges, right? And the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board actually identifies a set of disclosure topics, by sector, and you see them listed here, whether it's beef or fruit and vegetables or beverages or anything else. And I think part of strategy, particularly where communications is concerned, involves thinking about what is our winning narrative, and that's something we'd invite you to think about. Over the course of the presentation and in the days ahead, right? What is your winning narrative? I'm really confident that there are so many wonderful stories in Southern US agriculture and agricultural product manufacturing that can be more powerfully told and need to be more powerfully told for us to be successful. And so the question is your winning narrative around climate change, issues like water, biodiversity, waste? It's an overriding issue, that drives a lot of stakeholder concern. Is your winning narrative around health and safety, right? And we think there's a particular advantage that US products have, right? What's in my food? How is it grown? Where does it come from? Is it good for me, right? The quality story is such a good one for us to tell. And then, of course, there's a social impact, right? So that's looking at human rights, at the way we treat our workers, at obesity, at food security, at animal welfare. So there are a lot of issues there, and some of those issues are really they can be challenging, right? Because there are big conversations we're having in society today, and there's some anger, as we know, there's division, but if we can strike the right balance in talking about how we're contributing to and strengthening the social fabric, we can often win, the battle for the hearts and the minds of the sustainable consumer. So around climate change, it really is a story we find, thinking we all know the way the media work, they're essential, but they're also frustrating. And, every media story you see, right? It has certain characters that play out, heroes and villains and victims and activists and people who've made mistakes and, people are mad at them, whatever. And so think about which characters, you or your industry, might be playing right now, right? I mean, obviously, it's not. We certainly don't endorse this idea, but often you have agriculture, animal agriculture in particular, painted in an unflattering light because the fact is, of course, it is a major climate driver. That doesn't mean there isn't some really good stories and good stuff happening, but there is a reality there that we have to contend with. Deforestation, use of pesticides, fertilizers. Agriculture is feeling the impacts of climate change. And of course, there's a need for everybody involved in agriculture to play a role in addressing climate change. So how well we tell that story of our journey and help people understand the context behind the investments we're making and why it's not easy to do, right? But also why we're doing the right things and in an innovative and effective way. There's where we've got the opportunity to position ourselves, not as villains, not as victims, but as heroes. Second story is about safety. And here, it's of course deeply tied to transparency, to consumer literacy. Again, those questions, what am I eating, right? The conversation around GMOs, it tends to be more fear-based than fact-based. We've done work with health food, the Canadian Health Food Association, for example, and it's amazing just the power of the GMO-free labeling in terms of reaching consumers, right? Is it based on facts? Probably not, right? But it's increasingly effective, and we see that, right? Because there is increasing concern from consumers, from investors, from regulators around a series of issues related to safety. And the consumer is not as literate as we need he or she to be, right? We also find that this is an area that's rising, particularly in Canada, right? KPMG studies cited here showing that 34% of Canadian consumers have become more concerned about food safety during the pandemic. Interesting. It's and very challenging. The third point is about social impact, and I alluded a little bit to this earlier, how this can be a really challenging issue for organizations to navigate and to tell stories, right? Because there's increased scrutiny of social impacts. What's in our supply chains, right? And sometimes a lot of companies, this is an area of great risk because they don't always know, right? And this is touching every sector, certainly including agri-food. There's more focus on system change, not just behavior change, to solve these big issues. And we think here there's an opportunity because this should not be something that any one organization, has to solve alone, right? But we're seeing more and more around these questions, right? The war in Ukraine, of course, it's sparking more and more discussion around food security. The discussion about inequity continues to grow. And then there's a big question, right? That every company fundamentally has to address in its communications, right? And that's what do we stand for, right? Increasingly consumers, and you'll see this later when we present some data on the Canadian consumer in particular, they're attracted to companies that both articulate a clear purpose and then act on that purpose in a way that's visible. And ultimately, are they going to buy the best product, the best tasting product, the healthiest product? Of course. But the question is, when there's a tie, what breaks the tie? Well, this breaks the tie, right? And increasingly, people want to do business with companies that have a purpose and a set of values that they understand and that they agree with. So Jessie, tell us about the policy landscape.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was great. So moving on, and hopefully I will not be interrupted by the very large dog I have downstairs. I'm glad to be among animal lovers here. So the most important thing that I think it's important to know and understand about Canada's policy landscape is that when it comes to this issue, it's specific to climate change, really. And we're going to be focusing mostly on the environmental side of policy today, because that's really the biggest driver of the conversation and the policy landscape. And so the key thing to know and to understand is that the Canadian government has committed to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And they've actually enshrined that commitment in law, which means they will be held legally accountable toward achieving that goal and towards progress for it. So just to clarify, because I know there's a lot of terminology here, when we say net zero, what that means is it doesn't mean we're eliminating all emissions, because that's kind of nearly impossible. What we're doing is we're aiming to balance the books. So it means that as many emissions we're putting out into the world, we are removing from the world. And we're doing that through a whole bunch of mechanisms, but one of which is very relevant to agriculture, which is the fact that our agricultural lands, as we know, are important stores for carbon emissions. And that is not lost on policymakers, particularly here in Canada. So we're going to talk about that a little more. And as Dan alluded to earlier, we had a very big week in climate policy because our government just announced their emissions reduction plan, which is new legislation around how we are going to hit our next big milestone, which is to reduce emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030. And given that agriculture is responsible for about 10% of Canadian emissions, it's a really important focus of this plan. But I want to show you how it fits in sectorally, because I think it's really interesting, and it refers back to what I was just talking about, which is the role that agriculture is going to play. So if you can see, agriculture is this bottom blue layer. And you can actually see, like gray at the top here is transportation, teal is oil and gas. They have, obviously, they're big emitters, and you can see that the aim is to really bend the curve far down on the road to 2030. With agriculture, it's a much more subtle curve in emissions going down, but the real role that agriculture is playing here is in negative emissions. It's about taking emissions out of the atmosphere. And so I think that speaks a long way towards what we're thinking about in terms of the role that agriculture can play in the future of climate change. And it's that hero role that Dan was alluding to earlier. So it's important to think about as we're thinking about our own storytelling. So what does this sort of policy landscape mean for agriculture? Well, it is complicated. I would say that, there is certainly increased government understanding of the urgency of climate change to the sector, the challenges that the sector is facing, and also clearly the opportunity, that the role that the sector must play. There have been some high-level goals set in place for the sector, but there remains a lot of uncertainty around the pathway between where we are now, how we get to where we're going from where we are now. We do have a national vision, though, and it's embedded in what's called the Guelph Statement, which is a nice farming community in southwestern Ontario, where basically all of the ministers of agriculture across Canada came together to develop this vision that states clearly that our national goal is for Canada to be recognized as a world leader in sustainable agriculture and agri-food, not only to meet the demands of climate change, but to be able to expand into new markets and meet consumer expectations. And so it is a national priority. The economics of this is a national priority as much as the environmental considerations are. So let's take a look at the two key areas of focus. So when it comes to policy, obviously there is a focus on lowering emissions, and that's primarily looking at fertilizer, it's looking at fuel, and it's also looking at direct emissions, and that's, mostly comes from methane. And then there's another very big focus, which is really on ramping up innovation. And this is around resiliency, and it's also around carbon storage, which is relevant to what we were just talking about. And what I can say is that overall in the policy landscape in Canada, for the agricultural sector, there are a lot more carrots than there are sticks, which is, I think, good news. But there are some sticks. So let's talk about that very quickly. So one of the big issues in Canada in terms of policy is that we do have a carbon pricing regime in place. And this continues to be a live debate around how carbon pricing should work in terms of the agricultural sector. There is a bill on the table right now to exempt agriculture from some parts of carbon taxing, specifically for the use of fuels on farms, for natural gas that's used for grain drying. So there's a live debate around this, but the government has really made it very clear that carbon pricing is here to stay in Canada, and it's not going anywhere, and it will get more stringent over time. The actual specific target that applies to agriculture under our climate change policy is for fertilizer. And there is a goal to reduce emissions from fertilizers by 30% below 2020 levels over the next decade. And this is also, as you might imagine, very hotly debated. But the government has just this past month launched consultations and a discussion paper to have like roundtable discussions with industry about how we actually need to innovate and what we need to invest in to make it possible for agriculture to achieve this target without there being negative impacts on yield. Because ultimately it is in no one's best interest, not Canada's, not agriculture's, and not consumers, for there to be lower yield as a result of these targets, because we need food, as we started off this conversation by making very clear. And finally, there is the Global Methane Pledge, which of course the US is also signatory to. And what I can say is that right now in Canada, there is no specific policy target for methane for agriculture. There is for oil and gas, but not for ag. However, that is probably coming. And so the beef industry has actually decided to get ahead of the curve here. And Canada's beef industry has set its own very ambitious target to reduce methane emissions by 33%. And it's probably very smart that they are doing so, because it was just announced that later this year, we can expect Canada to roll out a whole economy methane reduction plan. And we can assume that agriculture would be included in that. So now let's take a look at the carrots. And what you're looking at here is a pretty complicated web of funding for all sorts of incentives to both create and to adopt better, more sustainable practices, innovations, and technologies that would ultimately drive down emissions from agriculture and really increase the ability of agricultural lands to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. And so we have, in the most recent legislation that just came out this week, there was a massive increase in investment here. This agricultural clean tech fund was tripled through this legislation, which demonstrates the focus on really advancing clean technology to be a solution driver for this space. There was also a massive new investment in this on-farm climate action fund, which is basically creating incentives for farmers to adapt these practices on the farm and giving them the resources to do that. The Living Labs program is also really interesting because it's allowing scientists and farmers and other stakeholders to work together to pilot and test and monitor new practices on working farms. And then the new sort of money that came out for agriculture in the latest bill was this $100 million for transformative science. And what this recognizes is that farmers are going to need better monitoring tools to be able to predict how climate is changing and how it's affecting the lands in a much more real-time data. And that's what this is meant to help drive. So where is this money flowing? it is flowing towards sustainable and rotational crop grazing, cover cropping, nitrogen management, more efficient grain dryers, the transition away from diesel, energy generation technologies like biodigesters and solar panels and biofuels. And this is really helping also creating sort of this more circular economy of creating sort of like waste to energy from farm products that we're seeing huge move there, as well as smart farming, precision agriculture, and how better data and internet integration can help us be more efficient, both in terms of how we use water and how we harvest. So one piece that I want to talk about, because it's so relevant to this concept of investing in agricultural lands as carbon sinks, is this opportunity of the carbon market, which is potentially the new frontier. And it's something that perhaps you've heard about, which is basically the opportunity for farmers to derive revenue from being able to pull emissions out of the atmosphere and be able to sequester them in the ground. So what's happening in Canada is the creation of a federal offset credit program, which would allow our big industrial emitters to buy offsets, particularly from farmers and other sort of natural solution producers, to be able to offset their emissions. And because it would be part of a federal program, it would create a little bit more consistency and certainty for being a part of that offset market. Now, I'll tell you that Alberta, the province of Alberta, is basically an exemplar for how this has worked in the past. But unfortunately, they're actually closing that program in 2020. They ended it at the end of 2021. And the reason why is that farmers were not getting enough bang for the buck. Basically, they weren't getting paid enough through the offset program to balance the costs of the yield impacts on sustainability. And this is a real equation that we're going to have to get right in order for this to work. So for those of you who are reading about and thinking about carbon markets, the word to the wise is to be cautious, pay attention, but don't jump in with full feet because the market is still working itself out right now. But ultimately, hopefully in the next decade, this can be a profitable revenue opportunity for farmers in the US and in Canada and across the world. So one last word on policy. And I'm actually going to let this famous clip from The Graduate say it for me. In addition to climate change, there is one very big issue that Canadian policymakers and consumers are focused on.
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
Okay, so, oh, here, let me pause that. So yes, so plastics. Oh my, you don't want to listen to it forever. Okay, I might just need to.
I just want to say one word.
But what's going on with plastics is that the government has actually set a target to ban reusable plastics in Canada. They are making very serious moves in this direction. It is going to really shape the landscape around packaging, straws, utensils, packaging. It's all going to come into effect. And so this is something to really be paying attention to. And it is particularly driven by consumer concerns and interest in this issue. It has really captured the heart of consumers in Canada. So that is something that you should know. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dan to talk about the sustainable consumer.
Okay, thank you, Jesse. Really interesting stuff on that policy landscape. So let's talk about the consumer. You know, and you folks identified, those of you who voted in the poll said, you know, that's where you're feeling the most pressure. And it's not hard to see why. And so we want to show you a little clip that highlights, in a funny way, the sort of consumer we're dealing with. This is actually a clip that's more than 10 years old, and of course it's a spoof. It's funny, but it does in a funny way make a point about whom we're dealing with right now.
Hey guys.
Hello.
Hi,
hello.
My name is Dana. I'll be taking care of you today. If you have any questions about the menu, please let me know.
I guess I do have a question about the chicken. If you could just tell us a little bit more about it.
The chicken is a heritage breed, woodland raised chicken that's been fed a diet of sheep's milk, soy, and hazelnuts.
Okay, this is local.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm gonna ask you just one more time, and it's local.
It is.
Is that USDA organic or Oregon organic or Portland organic?
It's just all across the board, organic.
Hazelnuts, these are local.
How big is the area where the chickens are able to roam free?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I had exactly the same question.
4 acres. Give me just a second. I'll be right back. Okay.
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 It's nice.
We're doing the right thing.
I'm too apologetic.
You are.
I drove way too slow here today, didn't I?
Yeah.
I'm so weird with that gas pedal. I think just moves the whole vehicle forward now.
All right. So here is the chicken you'll be enjoying tonight.
You have this information. This is fantastic.
Absolutely. His name was Colin. Here are his papers. Okay.
That's great. He looks like a happy little guy who runs around. A lot of friends, other chickens as friends, putting his little wing around another one and kind of like palling around.
I don't know that I can speak to that level of intimate knowledge about him. They do a lot to make sure that their chickens are very happy.
When you say they, I mean, who are these people raising Colin?
It's a farm that's located about 30 miles south of Portland.
And you have a good relationship with this farm.
We do.
It's not some guy on a yacht who lives in Miami who's just saying that he's organic.
It tears at the core of my being the idea of someone just cashing in on a trend like organic.
No, I know the type. No.
Yeah.
Tell you what, we're gonna go check it out if you don't mind. Just if you could hold our seats.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
I'll be right back. Just
we'll be
want to
right
make sure.
Just clean up. Thank you so much, Dana.
Sure.
All right, so we can roll our eyes, of course, we can laugh, and it's probably good to laugh, and of course it's wildly exaggerated, but there is a reality that we face, and that consumers aren't just an audience, they're part of the system, right? And if you think about the way all these gears work together and the various pressures, and also opportunities, to tell our story that come. There's consumer communications. It's linked to consumer concern and awareness and scrutiny. Changes in the way businesses have to report today, and of course the policy landscape that Jesse presented. So it's really complex. But let's talk about that consumer and go a little deeper. Now let's look at the real facts here, right? And it's interesting. Like you have here the big picture stat about 65% caring about buying local, but you drill down a little bit. You ask people making more than $150,000 in Canada, are you willing to pay a premium for local products? 69% say yes, right? But you ask people earning less than 50,000, 65% say yes, right? So it's that's and I was actually kind of surprised to see that data, because that shows that local products are important across all income groups, even those of more limited means, right? You see here for the other data, 33% paying more for ethical and environmental considerations, 42% wanting to avoid the use of plastic, often perceived by consumers as a product's biggest environmental issue. And of course, as Jesse alluded to, the federal government is gradually moving to ban single-use plastics in Canada. And we're seeing that I'm sure you're seeing that in many markets in which you're operating around the world. Now, an interesting opportunity is around organic, because 65 to 85% of organic food consumed in Canada is imported. So the fact that people are willing to pay a premium, that's an opportunity. 34% paying more for brands known for sustainability. And here's another interesting point. If you think of you would say Gen Z, we'd say Gen Z, but whatever we call it, right? They are very much at the forefront of this movement, even more so than millennials. So 47% of people aged 18 to 24, they would pay a premium for environmentally friendly food offerings. And that is 12% higher than their millennial peers. So interesting stuff. So On the next slide, we hope here there's a little bit of inspiration for you, right? Just so you can see what some organizations in the market are doing. So on the left, and obviously these are large organizations, large and industries. So on the left, you've got Loblaws, again, I alluded to them earlier, the largest grocery retailer in Canada. So they've got a brand that's called Free From, right? So free from whatever, right? And that marketing campaign, it has key information about what is and what is not in the food, right? With pictures and locations for the picture and the location of the producer highlighted. In the middle, there's a campaign from another major Canadian grocery retailer, Sobeys. And the entire campaign is called This Fish. And it's looking at traceability technology, enabling people to scan a QR code so that they can see exactly where the fish was caught. The third example is from the egg farmers of Ontario, the largest Canadian province. So in 2020, they unveiled this campaign where you have the farmers themselves answering questions from consumers, right? So the look and feel of the ads, you see here the tagline is real farmers, real eggs, photography kind of done, and you see the guys. It's like selfie style. You can't see the guy's left arm, right? And so it's got a real feel of speaking directly to consumers, sharing their personal stories, rebuilding and rekindling that connection that we all have with the land. So really interesting seeing what marketers are doing and how they're communicating. So Jesse, take us a little deeper into one Canadian example.
Absolutely. So I'm going to run it very quickly through a company that really stands out in this space, and that is Maple Leaf Foods. And Maple Leaf Foods is a bit of a darling among communication people like Dan and I, because they have long been an example of how to kind of do it right when it comes to engaging the public and speaking to the public. And it actually stems from how they handled a massive health safety crisis, a listeria outbreak in 2008. And the communications around that crisis from the CEO, it modeled authentic, values-based, and transparent communications. And the CEO said himself, what carried us through 2008, that crisis, was our deep commitment to the leadership values that are so important to our organization, acting with integrity, doing what's right, followed by a sense of transparency, accountability, and action orientation. And what Maple Leaf has done is it has taken those principles and it has really translated them into its leadership around aiming to be the most sustainable protein company in the world. And the brand has really evolved over that decade. It launched a real food manifesto in 2018 focused on alleviating parents' concerns about what's in the food that they are feeding their kids. There was a really phenomenal Super Bowl ad that got a lot of attention around that, that really resonated with people. And in 2019, the company took the bold step of becoming the world's first major carbon neutral food company. And at the time, it was one of the only 3 companies in the world to adopt science-based targets for emissions. And so let's talk about sort of what they are getting right. Well, we are not all, and nor can we be, Maple Leaf Foods, which is a gigantic corporation. But there are some lessons that we can take away from what they are doing. And one of them is that they have really simple, really clear, and really well integrated framework for how they talk about environmental, social, and governance issues. It's better food, better care, better communities, better planet. Everybody can understand that. They build their commitments as well as their progress reports around those categories, and it all comes together in a way that really supports strong storytelling as well as good reporting and transparent reporting. They've also moved beyond just focusing on their own impact. So, they are looking at how do we reduce our own emissions and how do we reduce our own impact, but they're looking at how do we create shared value to help solve global issues. So for example, one of the things that they've done is they've built thought leadership around food security. And they've developed partnerships with other organizations around advancing issues around food security in Canada and globally. And so they're creating that sense of shared value beyond just, we're not just eliminating the bad, we're actually creating something new and good. And finally, something that they're doing that is really interesting is instead of sort of fighting a sustainability trend, which was, this consumer interest in plant-based proteins, they've actually embraced it. And so they innovated a product which was half plant-based protein and half meat protein to kind of let people explore and try out. They went into the industry and decided to see if they could build some market share there, which they did. And they're kind of like, we're watching how that industry is doing, right? Some of it's doing well. It's kind of like maybe petering off a little bit. But I mean, the fact is that instead of seeing it as like, we have to defend ourselves and we have to push back against this, they thought, okay, how can we evolve to what consumers are demanding and to what consumers are interested in? So what I wanted to point out is how they're benefiting from this, right? So from a profit perspective, even during COVID, their protein sales grew to $1.1 billion in Q4. And the company really credits this to the strength of its sustainable meats business. And, the COO said, the strength of their sustainable meats business is what is providing the meaningful point of differentiation for them that enabled their expansion into the US market. So I think that's really important to know and understand. From an investor perspective, they're seen as the lowest risk protein investment in the world. From a social impact perspective, they have created this platform where they can now get in front of consumers around the issues that consumers are concerned about, such as food security and where food comes from and addressing climate change. And they continue to be an employer of choice in Canada, which obviously attracting the best talent in the world is a huge competitive advantage. So we'll end there with some food for thought for you.
Okay, so final thoughts here. Our advice, if we have to boil it all down to just a few things for you to think about, and we hope that spending time on some examples of organizations that are leading and how they're leading might be helpful, so that you can see, what different players in the market are up to here in Canada. So if you want to lead, point number one, leadership is hard, right? And a lot of companies aspire to it or claim that they are and make all sorts of bold claims, beating their chests in their marketing and communications. You have to be careful, because leadership really, in our experience, you've got to be able to credibly claim that you are the first to do something, the best at doing something, or the only one doing something, right? That's if you aspire to lead. Now, regardless of whether you have that quality of story to lead today or to aspire to lead in the future, we think it's really important to show the connection between the commitments you're making and how they all add up, right? A lot of it is about the transparency of the reporting and the credibility of the reporting, even if the story isn't as good today as you aspire for it to be tomorrow. Commit to consistency, to telling stories over time that are tied to your purpose and values. Show your journey and progress. Show transparently where you're doing well and where there's still a journey to walk, right? So that you can highlight your progress over time. Make sure that you use every channel to communicate. So not just, earned media, but, paid media, advertising, owned media, your websites and your assets, shared media, your social channels, right? Think about how you're communicating through all of those channels. A lot of companies, when they talk about sustainability or social responsibility, they'll talk about local initiatives, and that's really good and really important. So they might say, we provided meals to 50,000 people in the last 10 years, right? The challenge is sometimes that's not connected to a broader target, right? And so if you said instead, We provided 50,000 meals to people in the last 10 years. And that's towards our goal of helping to reduce hunger in our community by 30% by 2030, right? That's showing a broad target and an ambition that people can rally around and get behind, right? Whether it's you doing it alone or doing it more likely in partnership with others. Think about how to make it accessible and actionable for regular people. Think about how your employees can participate. Showcase your leadership commitment. There's no substitute in the end for leaders taking responsibility and owning the story and showing their personal commitment to it. And of course, you're not alone, right? And that's ultimately what SUSTA is all about. It's about partnership with peers, with governments, with experts, with civil society, who can add credibility to what we're doing, but pool our resources to be stronger together. So we'll leave you with a few questions for you to think about and to strategize with your teams. We are sure that in your organization, you have some wonderful secret sustainability stories and maybe some barriers that are holding you back from telling it. Think about what those barriers are, whether it's just not having told it yet, and just needing the initiative to do so, or perhaps there's some area of the story that you need to improve. That's okay, but think about what that story is and how you can remove those barriers. Think then about the communications opportunities in front of you and how you might seize them. And finally, think about who needs to better understand your journey, right? We presented broadly a list of key drivers and stakeholders, but ultimately you know who they are and who matters to you. Enhancing their understanding, communicating effectively with them, not only will that increase their affinity for you and your organization and your brands and your products, but it'll also improve your bottom line. So we thank you so much for your time. We thank you for the ongoing partnership that we're privileged to have with you and to build on with you. We wish you much success this year, and we'd be happy to take any questions if there's time to do so. But it's not time limited, in that you can also follow up with us after this webinar. Thanks, Danielle, and I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Thanks, Jesse. That was great. Without even really collaborating on our presentations, we ended up saying some similar things. Just the work matters, but it's also communicating what the work you're doing around sustainability. That communication portion or piece is so important, so that it's not the best kept secret. So if anybody has questions, like Daniel said, now is the time, but I do realize we're a little over an hour, so I don't see anything coming in, but we would, of course, welcome any questions via email later, and I'll be posting the recording to the website behind your My SUSTA login. And yeah, it's just great to have you all. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this, on this really important and interesting topic. So we appreciate you.
Thank you, Danielle.
All right. Yeah, thanks, everybody. Have a great Thursday, and I will be in touch with all of you via email.
Thank you, Danielle.
All right.
Okay,
Thanks, Corinda. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.